Hello everybody, you're all welcome to another Zoom meeting with Social Rights Ireland. I'm Roisin and we're delighted to have Joti Brar this evening, who is, I think I put in the digital flyer, Joti, you're a working class defender of the working class, you are a fighter for the working class, and also when you're going out, people like us are going out searching to understand and find comrades who are truly anti-imperialist. You're one of the few, and that's why we felt it was really important to invite you on, because we are in Ireland. You know, it's surprising, it's shocking, or it's really, really sad to think that given our history, given our reputation on the world stage being the fighting Irish or the rebellious Irish, that actually we are living in a time where a lot of people are feeling disenfranchised and absolutely disillusioned with the so-called left. So maybe just on that note, Joti, to start, um, do you think this is similar to what's happening in Britain? And are you surprised, or have you realised how bad things are in Ireland as well?
It's a really interesting question, Roisin. Thank you so much for having me. Nice to meet all of you, and I'm looking forward to hearing, from all of you in the conversation, because obviously it's a good chance for me to learn more about Ireland as well and your reality than just to tell you what I think about things. But, I'm of an age where my earliest lessons in imperialism and anti-imperialism were all centered around the Irish liberation struggle, right? Because, of course, when I was growing up, what they call the Troubles, right? The Liberation War in the North was a live war. It was a live issue. I grew up watching TV where Sinn Féin representatives had to be blacked out and voiced over by actors, and they were sort of presented to us as these kind of crazy gangsters. But I, of course, grew up in an anti-imperialist household where my parents supported the armed struggle and supported the IRA and Sinn Féin and, all of what was happening there. And my earliest kind of independent political life was very much, in my 20s. I went to the north several times and regularly went back, particularly to Derry, over years on the Bloody Sunday commemorations and things like that. Some of my earliest marches in London as a teenager were Bloody Sunday commemoration marches. I remember, going along the Holloway Road with this band of, really militant London Irish. And it's been very strange, to say the least, for me personally, to see the trajectory of the Irish political situation since the peace process. For whatever were the shortcomings of the militant generation of, Sinn Féin and the Irish liberation struggle members in the North, who were that bit older than me, who were fighting during the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, they were anti-imperialist. They might not have all been, Marxists and socialists in that, but they were proper anti-imperialists. They understood imperialism. They knew what they were fighting. They knew whose side they were on in the world. And I never expected to see a situation where you have, Sinn Féin for me just signed their death warrant when they came out all in favor of the Ukraine war. I said, oh my God, that's it now. They've become thoroughly co-opted. We could watch them becoming more and more kind of professional and institutionalized and say, oh, well, okay, but maybe they're still pursuing the whole goal of United Ireland and, whatever. But that, there was something that was built into the peace process that for me was a really fatal flaw. And that was this reliance on the European Union as some kind of neutral arbiter and some kind of mechanism for bringing, Ireland back together through its nice neutral kind of oversight, right? And Sinn Féin didn't used to treat the EU that way. I remember when they had all that opposition to, was it Maastricht? They had a big campaign against it, both sides of the border. And then suddenly there became this kind of institutional assumption that the European Union is some kind of a force for good. And that was really, the beginning of a very slippery slope, I think. And the reason I'm focusing so much on Sinn Féin, apologies that, you guys live in the south but for me that was really pivotal in bringing together the militant anti-imperialist sections of the working class of Ireland, on both sides of the border, actually. But obviously the Northern struggle was a massive deal for us when I was growing up. And really, Sinn Féin were seen as, and IRA were seen as the cutting edge, really, of, you know, the anti-imperialist struggle in Ireland. They were leading it, you know, whether or not you like the fact that it was them who was leading it, they were leading it, you know. And they've abnegated that role, and no one's really stepped in to fill it. And what I find also kind of tragic is that Ireland, like so many countries, had a communist party that followed kind of meekly in the wake of Khrushchevite revisionism and has not recovered from that either. So, you know, you don't have anywhere in Ireland now that I've seen a really strong working class organisation, despite all your history, that really understands what imperialism is and brings together all of that anti-imperialist energy and historical memory that I think is still really latent in your population. It's a very different situation you have in Ireland than we have in Britain, right? When it comes to that, you know, the tradition of anti-imperialist struggle, the understanding of the need for national sovereignty, you know, and all of so many people's family histories of being involved in that struggle. I find it quite heartbreaking to see how rudderless all of that is. But at the same time, you know, we're now in a situation where it's increasingly needed. More and more people are realizing that it's needed. And I think because the way the objective conditions are developing, something that has the right orientation has the potential actually to grow very quickly in Ireland, as in many countries in the world, because of the way the conditions are changing, because of the way that the drive to war and the austerity that's being forced on workers everywhere is really massively accelerating a decline in people's living standards and an insecurity and a lack of faith in any kind of future under the present economic system. Then I think, you know, the right organisation with a proper orientation of genuine anti-imperialism that genuinely wants to serve the Irish people can take root and grow actually quicker than you might think. You know, it's very easy to think we're small, we can't do anything. You know, you look back at a period when people's lives have been relatively stable and secure, and they've kind of just become cynical about politics. But as the conditions develop, that cynicism is going to turn to something different. And what it really needs is an organisation that's able to give it guidance.
Yeah, I do think that there are lots of, you know, small grassroots organizations out there that and really what would you say, sound activists who have good political theoretical understanding, you know, revolutionary understanding. But also I think that when you go to set up a group from grassroots, what you find is, and you try to be, you know, welcoming and all-encompassing of the disenfranchised, you know, that it's so easy for it to be co-opted, or, you know, there's still this reliance on the old way of doing things, or bourgeois democracy, you know, oh, but who should we vote for in the meantime, you know, rather than how can we build in the meantime. So that can be a little bit frustrating to say the least. I'm going to
do you mind if I just add something in there? Sorry, because you made me think of something. I talk a lot. One is what you just referred to there about the essentially something we have to all be really aware of is there's a co-optation machine. It's really strong. And it's actually across the world. The imperialists have perfected this ability that as soon as a little campaign starts to get going, and it's run by power of real grassroots working class organisers who want to change something in their community, as soon as they start to get a bit organised and a bit confident and a bit of a head of steam going, someone will swoop in from the establishment and try to make it part of their party machinery. In our country, of course, it's always the Labour Party. I don't know exactly how that works in Ireland, but I'm sure you've got the same setup. And around the world, if it's not political parties, it's the NGO machinery. And it's the way that working class communities are essentially beheaded of their natural leadership. And those natural leaders stop being spokespeople for their community and they become professional do-gooders. and dolers out of imperialist charity and controllers of a movement that they once represented. So that whole NGOization of rebellion and grassroots movements, that's a real phenomenon. That's not just a localized frustration. That is a global phenomenon. And imperialism's really perfected that. So that's something that, we, when we're organizing politically, have to recognize that, we have to be on the lookout for that and absolutely, exposing it and making sure people don't fall for it. And the other thing I just wanted to talk about that I've noticed, it's happening everywhere. I've noticed it with a particular sense of heartbreak in Ireland, is the way that as conditions get worse, and particularly in the case of Ireland, it's the housing crisis, isn't it? What you're finding is the demagoguery that's being implanted into poor working class communities regarding immigration and asylum seekers and refugees. And I saw it was kind of funny in a way, because it's so ahistorical and illiterate politically and sociologically. But it was also heartbreaking to see a sign of a demonstrator, obviously, angry working class guy in Ireland, just, hacked off with the lack of access to housing, but had been totally taken in by these racist arguments about immigration, holding up a sign that said, Ireland is full. You couldn't really make it up, could you? You really severed people from their history to be able to say to them, Ireland is full, and they'll buy it. Ireland's bloody empty. It's renowned to be empty, and has been for 200 years, underpopulated, right? And never recovered since the bloody famine. And it's really sad for militant working class people to be on the streets with a kind of sign that says that, and shows you the danger of, when we're not acting to mobilize people and bring them towards revolutionary and socialist understanding of their problems and their solutions, that the ruling class is working really, really hard to mobilize them as a force for reaction against their own interests, right? And that's something we have to get really good at doing as well, is not just opposing that kind of movement by screaming at people who've been misled and saying, oh, you bloody racist, but helping them see they're being manipulated by their class enemies against their own best interests. We are their real friends. The people who've been tricking them with these lies about immigration are there to mislead them and use them against their own class. And that's something we've got to learn how to explain to people. They're difficult conversations, right? But it's a really important one, because there's huge amount of this provocative, provocateurs being sent into poor working class communities, and a whole load of, incendiary statements and ideas being put out there to misdirect people's anger.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up just organically, Joti, because it's becoming very problematic, and in many ways it's a bit of a distraction as well, because with this anti-immigrant pushback, then we're seeing the rise of the Antifa movement. And so you've got two sects of people screaming at each other, shouting each other down. And that makes me feel very uncomfortable sometimes to be in those spaces, while I am an anti-fascist, and I oppose fascism on the strongest terms. I wish that the venom and the energy could be directed at the root cause. And, it's really easy to punch down on both sides, but it seems to be the bigger challenge seems to be, how do we mobilize people to go to the racist institutions, go to the EU, even if it's a demo, try to get 5 or 10 people to demonstrate outside the EU. And they're, oh no, God, you couldn't do that, But if you want to mobilize and do a call out for, the fascia around the corner, suddenly
have a street fight.
Have a street fight. And this idea of revolution looking like that as well, so the lack of understanding of theory, really is something maybe seems so boring. I've tried to set up, classes, Marxist reading, James Connolly reading circle, and they're never terribly popular, and yet people still want to ask you, privately text you, about what, like, come to the class, come and learn or read yourself. I'm going to hand over now to Morgan, maybe because I want to thank Morgan as well for arranging this conversation. He's been brilliant behind the scenes, and maybe invite you, Morgan, to engage a wee bit or to ask Joti questions, hard questions.
Sure. Well, given that, Joti, first of all, I'm very delighted that you could give your time to us this evening. I'm a great fan of your ability to communicate. I think you're a very skilled operator. I think you're very likable, and I wish that we had a few Brars in Ireland, because I think you could do a lot of damage here. But yeah, I took down a couple of questions. Obviously, I could ask you questions based off the stuff that you've already said. It's obviously very thought provoking, and it's very accurate. But I suppose in most of these recordings, I try and I do mention the topic of Syria, which I know you're very, very, very strong on when we're talking about anti-imperialism here. So the reason I bring up Syria quite a lot is that I think I suppose it represents the most glaring opportunity for geopolitical education, because it went on for 12 or 13 years longer than it was intended to, the war on Syria. It exposed obviously many contradictions and displays all the various methods used by imperialists to dismantle a state. I find, however, that due to being bombarded with the same escalating narrative for over a decade, some of the older generations cannot or will not address their own understandings of the war. They won't interrogate their own understandings, and I've observed that it's amongst the youth that I've encountered a willingness to dismiss the pervading narratives on the war and link the war to the wider struggle against imperialism in West Asia. Do you see similar patterns in the UK, and do you see the utility in perhaps creating material tailored to the younger generations in order to reach those that can be educated or are willing to be educated? And by that, I could mean, podcast series or utilizing new, I suppose, messaging apps that young people kind of congregate on. Perhaps even like creating material to hand out to young activists who attend the Palestine protests in Ireland that are, that unfortunately aren't being suitably educated by the Palestine protests for some of the reasons that you've already mentioned.
Definitely. Thanks, Morgan. That's a really, really interesting perspective and a really interesting question. Yes, the war on Syria, as you know, I'm sure all the people in here know, it was a proxy war. It was basically a NATO war, US and British imperialism at the front of that. But they hid behind a variety of proxies. And this was something that caused a lot of confusion, I think, because there were various points when the USA claimed to be fighting some of its own proxies. But if you take a step back, you realize that's actually a trick they've played on us before. With the war on drugs, they did it, right? They set up narco gangs in various places, and then they used the existence of those gangs to send their soldiers into countries in Latin America. I'm thinking specifically of Colombia, and then in the whole region. There's narco gangs over here. They've been set up and funded by the Americans, right? But that's their opportunity to then justify taking their troops in. And the more the troops are there, right, the bigger the narco gangs get, the bigger the drug problem becomes. So, and it's very similar to the picture we saw in the Sahel, right? There's all these terrorists flooding out of Libya. How did that happen? Nobody knows. It's a mystery. And then American and French imperialism come in to save the day and save the people from being attacked by these terror squads. And guess what? While the American imperial and the French bases are there, the terrorists are running rampant and terrorizing the people. And they only start to be properly dealt with when you get rid of the Americans and the French, because it turns out they were protecting and facilitating them. So we had something very similar in Syria with this endless stream of constantly evolving proxies, some of which the USA claimed were good people, and some of which they claimed were evil, but all of which they were funding. And that included, Turkish proxies, different strands of jihadists, Syrian defense forces. Remember, they made up this army that was supposedly moderate rebels. They had a whole load of different forces. But when you really look behind the scenes, what you saw was an invading army of proxy mercenary jihadists who'd been picked up from around Asia and Europe by the Americans and British, trained in Turkey and shoved in as their renton army, and paid through the nose, armed to the teeth, and given a license to commit any crime, against the target population, which was, Syrians, to destroy the Syrian state. And I have to say, it's another one that for me was very personal. I was on the side of Syria from the very beginning, very clear that it was a provocation and a proxy war and not a civil war. We never went along with that civil war narrative. We always knew it was an invasion and a war of regime change. And I actually thought that the Syrians had won out. When I saw President Assad going to China to meet Xi Jinping, when I saw the deal, rapprochement kind of being signed between Iran and Syria, I thought, this is the beginning of the end for the imperialist kind of war effort in Syria. And really, I personally let my guard down and thought, okay, they've done it. They've seen it all through. They've fended it all off. And now they're just going to gradually, get back their territory and start rebuilding. And I did know what a terrible state the population was in. I met Syrians and Lebanese abroad who've talked to me about, the fact that essentially what you saw in Syria was like a genocide of its young people, because not only it was kind of very genocidal warfare, ethnic cleansing, and all kinds of, population movements and just mass murder of whoever the mercenaries could get hold of inside Syria, but also the economic conditions that were created made a situation where essentially a huge proportion of the young people just left the country in order to get paid work, because the economy had just been so destroyed and they were being throttled so badly. I believe that was now coming to an end. It was very hard to see the fall of Syria. But what I think was really significant about it is, if you look at the broader picture of the Middle East, in fact, although it's a setback for the axis of resistance, the general direction of travel for the two camps of imperialism and anti-imperialism hasn't actually changed. I don't think it really made imperialism much stronger. In fact, I think it gave them a whole load of new headaches to try to deal with. And when it comes to the resistance axis, in many ways, they now have a whole new area of activity. I mean, there's a huge amount of course, suffering for ordinary people in Syria, even more suffering than there was before. But I think you're right, Morgan, to say that the whole history of that war is a really good case study in imperialism. It's also something you can use to illustrate what people should also be using what's going on in Palestine to illustrate, which is, what is Zionism? That Zionism is a tool of imperialism. Why was Syria targeted? For like 75 years, Syria was targeted. Why? Because it never made a rapprochement with Israel. It was always anti-Zionist. It was always the main base for all the Palestinian liberation forces. It was always their, depth in terms of strategic depth, the safe haven they could go to. It was the one country in the Middle East that treated Palestinian refugees with dignity as equal peoples and not as just a exploitable labor force. They remained anti-Zionist and anti-imperialist throughout their history. That's why they were targeted, and it's also a very good lesson, I think, for people who claim to be friends of Palestine, to look at who are the celebrities and, movement leaders who are held up to us as friends of Palestine who celebrated the fall of Syria. Because every single one of those is not a friend of Palestine. It doesn't matter what they say. They're not a friend of Palestine if they celebrated the fall of Assad and the fall of free anti-Zionist, anti-imperialist Syria. So there's a whole lot of really useful and important lessons in the existence of Syria and the way it operated, in the way that it was targeted, in the way that the war was fought against it, and in the essence of what Zionism is, which is a tool of imperialism for control of the Middle East and its resources. So all of those things, I think you're right, are means of helping to educate those who want to be educated. And what we're finding in Britain, I'm sure, is something similar you're finding in Ireland, which is there is a growing core of people in the Palestine solidarity movement who really do want answers to these questions, who are asking in a way they never asked before, what is this Zionism? Like, then, given what's going on right in front of their eyes in real time, they want to know. And they're interested in genuine answers. And so what's developing, and I think is terrifying, certainly the ruling class in Britain, which is so invested as the main inventor of Zionism and one of the main backers of the Zionist project still to this day, is the fact that that anti-Zionist core of the Palestine solidarity movement is developing an increasingly anti-imperialist consciousness. And they're starting to connect British imperialism with the crimes of Israel properly in a systemic way. And these people who've been mobilized to the street, and indeed the mass of the Palestine demonstrations in Britain, which have been huge, by the way, have not been mobilized by the people who put themselves at the front and claim leadership of it. And those people are also not really able, these controlled opposition leaders are not really able to demobilize the Palestine solidarity movement either, although they have been trying very hard to do so. They haven't been able to do it because they didn't really call those people out. And those people there have much more radical view and much more persistent demands than the people who claim to be their leaders and occupy the speaking platforms and all the rest of it. So there's something very, very important about the development of the Palestine solidarity movement. And there's a key opportunity to develop and grow this heart of really anti-imperialist consciousness that's beginning to develop inside of there.
Well, that's no, you're quite right, and it's actually quite similar in Ireland as well in terms of the Palestine solidarity leadership structure. A lot of the same people are kind of involved either directly or indirectly with the Palestine campaigns in Ireland that would have been part of the Irish anti-war movement in the early 2010s. And quite similarly to the UK, they were basically filled with spoilers, people who with, I suppose, their own personal agendas. We had this famous character in Ireland that we spoke about once before in this podcast about, he's a gentleman called Mahdi al-Arati, if you're not familiar with him. You probably are, I can see you nodding. Yeah, so of course he was courted by the Irish anti-war movement. He was a big part of the movement for a while. He was part of a flotilla to Gaza in 2010. And he was being courted by a leader of an Irish opposition party called Richard Boyd Barrett, and several others who, through him and with him, advocated for the arming of the Libyan insurgency and later the Syrian insurgency. So, you know, we had these kind of people in our midst, and we didn't deal with them sufficiently. And the same people that were in charge of the Irish anti-war movement, a lot of them are still involved in Irish politics. A lot of them are still involved in Irish campaigns, and they don't really serve a purpose. They don't really serve to educate the very many people that have accumulated around the Palestine protests. And there is an appetite for a greater understanding and more, I suppose, anti-imperialist struggle against the war machine, both here in Ireland and in the UK. But a lot of people we found have also left the Palestine campaign disillusioned with the direction that it was taking. So do you think they're still in I suppose, still accumulated around the campaigns in Britain? Do you still see the opportunities there, you're saying? To
100%, yeah.
Mobilize them. Yeah.
Definitely. And in fact, for our party, it's an absolute priority all around the country to get along wherever people are turning out for Palestine, because they still are, and they are desperate for a meaningful message and some genuine explanation about what the hell is going on here, and including why it is that it hasn't been stopped. Right? It's baffling to a lot of people. They can see that all around the world, the mass of humanity is so angry and incensed about this, and yet all of their activity does nothing. Even when states try to intervene, like South Africa did through the ICJ, nothing happens. Why is that? You know, and again, it's only real, genuine anti-imperialists, Marxists, who can explain that to people. And we have a prime opportunity now. There are people angry enough about this to leave their homes, right? That makes them people who are looking for answers. And, you know, we've got information, we've just got to do what we can to get it to them. Could I just add something actually along the lines of what you were talking about there, Morgan? Just where you were talking about, I forget, Mahdi, was it? Mahdi?
Mahdi al-Arati, he's a Libyan brigade commander.
So again, something that many of us were not aware of as it was being developed, and it was only became clear when you look back. Because, you know, I was involved in those kind of convoy to Gaza period of time. That's where I met your comrade John Herson there. I went on a convoy with a group called Viva Palestina that was fronted up by George Galloway when he was in the Respect Party. And of course, the Respect Party was basically a lash up between George Galloway and the Socialist Workers' Party, right? So Trotskyite foot soldiers, and very much a Trotskyite kind of orientation. Now, I went just because I was able to make the time, and I, like many people, was incensed about what was being done to Gaza all the way back down then in, you know, 2008, 2009, 2010, right? And we really thought if we put enough pressure on, the siege would get broken, because this was, you know, unconscionable, and so much of humanity was opposed to what was happening. So I went on this convoy, and I wasn't a political person. I was just a member of a van team, you know, in this big convoy. I was totally a foot soldier. I was not a general. I was not a part of any of the organizing or political direction. And what was interesting to me later to look back on and realize as events transpired, because first we had the Arab uprisings in like Tunisia and Europe and Egypt. And then we had this wave of kind of fake uprisings that were very obviously massaged and created by Western powers for their own ends. And what happened in Libya and Syria was very much part of that, right? It was like a fake uprisings to justify imperialist interventions. And looking back, I realized that a whole bunch of the people who came on the convoy to Gaza with us were basically aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood and with various imperialist agencies. A lot of the young men of Pakistani Muslim heritage who came from Britain had basically been radicalized by mosques that I look back now and realize they were Saudi-backed mosques. They were being groomed to be Wahhabi foot soldiers. I was with them, and we're, you know, they're doing their religious thing, but it's for Palestine. We're all together. I made friends with some of them. Some of them were, you know, nice boys. But afterwards, I look back and I was like, I remember being surprised when we went through Syria on that convoy, and Syria was the country that treated us the best. They gave us hotel space the first time we went through. When we came back and we had to wait there for a while, they gave us a whole kind of youth camp to occupy on the coast in Latakia. The citizens of Syria welcomed us into their homes. The government of Syria put us on the news and the media and gave us official support. And yet there was a lot of hostility towards Syria from a lot of the people I was traveling with that I couldn't at that time understand where that came from. Looking back, I realized, because after the proxy war started in Syria, some of those same people I'd been on the convoy with popped up in Syria, like with the white helmets or with this or that aid organization. And I was like, you know, over time, I started to piece this thing together and realize, like you said, we got all these sleepers in our midst, and how the imperialists have been operating over this time that, you know, I've been completely oblivious to all those dynamics as it was happening. But looking back, it became very clear, you know, that this strategy of going around the world, including their own populations, and finding people who feel left behind, who haven't had a decent education, who don't have good life prospects, and radicalizing them based on their religious identity, which, by the way, most of them were not into their religious identity at all until the mosque came and started grooming them and telling them, you know, well, Allah's got a plan for you, you know. They were like born again Muslims, you know, they weren't Muslims who'd grown up as teenagers and through their life being into their religion. It was very noticeable, that sort of pattern. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of share that, really, that experience, and you know, firsthand seeing how that worked.
Yeah, it was very interesting learning about, obviously too late, but I learned about the very many Libyans that were settled in the UK, whose I suppose their citizenship was facilitated by the security services, and they formed their own communities. And again, many of their youth were radicalized. It was actually the next generation of Libyans, after very many of them left in the late 80s and early 90s, that were sent back, whose transfer to Libya was facilitated by, NATO infrastructure and the British security services to overthrow Gaddafi. And obviously very many of them then went to Syria with the weapons from Libya, from the Turkish border into Syria. And I think Ahmadi al-Arati, he was a Tripoli brigade leader, and then he went on to be an Al-Umma brigade leader, which was aligned with the Al-Nusra Front. Very many British citizens were facilitated in that group, and then they went on to fight with the Islamic State. It's quite stunning. And these were British citizens. These were people that were, and there's been no comeuppance. There's been no, I suppose, blowback for the British state on that. There's been a massacre, obviously, in Manchester that was carried out by the Abedi brothers, not just Salman Abedi, but the Abedi brothers. And they were fighters in Libya as well. They were part of this Manchester brigade that was sent over. This is stuff that needs to be taught to people. Like, people need to know about these terrible crimes that their state have committed, not just on Libya and Syria, but also on their own people. It's dreadful, and I suppose it should serve as motivation for us to actually kind of spread this word and I suppose reach as many people as we can, because we can't leave that lie knowing about that.
Definitely.
Thanks, Morgan. Thanks, Joti. Mumtaz has a question, and then maybe a question from Thibault.
Hello, Joti. Do you hear me?
I can.
Yes, hi. So I'm actually Iranian, and one of the things regarding imperialism is that, for example, with the Iranian government, the people who have opportunity to import, they actually put their money into dollars, and they, get their iPhones, iPads, and everything. And it's my understanding that the bourgeois class of people, Iran, they are oriented toward the West. And that's how I look at it as being imperialist. Like, they have this imperialistic mindset that anything that we import from the West is a good quality, and so on and so forth. So here's my question for you. How would you define imperialism and the anti-imperialism to it, reaction to it?
Thanks, Mumtaz. So you can't term any section of the bourgeoisie in Iran as imperialist. Imperialism is advanced capitalism that's reached the stage of monopoly and been forced to go outside its national borders in order to keep making profits because its own working class has become so impoverished. In historical terms, the first countries that became capitalist went on to become imperialist for precisely that reason, because they'd impoverished their own workers, and they could no longer produce profitably for markets within their own national territories. They had to expand out. Having done that and taken the territory of the whole world and carved it up between them, imperialism became a global system, a system of global capitalism. And most of the countries of the world were subjugated in that system. They were forced to send raw materials and goods and provide cheap labor for the imperialist economies, and to buy imperialist goods from the monopoly corporations based out of the advanced capitalist countries. And this system was had a hole blasted into it during the First World War. The First World War was a war between groups of imperialist countries fighting over who gets to control what sources profit-taking and control of what raw materials and colonies in the world in 1914 to 1918. That was a big bust-up between imperialist powers. They not only weakened themselves in doing that, they also brought about the October Revolution in Russia, which then founded the world's first socialist state. And the imperialist system ever since that time has been faced with the constant threat of more socialist revolution. The fact is that imperialism has become a very unstable system. It needs constant expansion, but at the same time, it centralizes wealth to such an extent. The masses of humanity are too poor to buy the products that the imperialists need you to buy in order to keep making profits. So that's I can't give a more detailed explanation in a short discussion like this, but fundamentally the countries which are imperialist are the same ones that were imperialist really back in 1914, apart from Russia. Russian imperialism was replaced by Soviet socialism. And in the world today, although the Soviet Union is gone, Russia is part of the anti-imperialist camp of sovereign and independent countries, as opposed to the imperialist camp of dominating monopoly capitalist countries. Iran is a country that was colonized, but broke free of colonization with the 1979 revolution and has been struggling to maintain its independence ever since. Now, it's very true that the Iranian bourgeoisie is divided, and that there is a section of the Iranian bourgeoisie that's constantly looking to turn back the clock and just become totally a comprador bourgeoisie, i.e. to facilitate imperialist looting of Iran and make money out of that situation. So they are the ones that constantly look to the West and laud the West and want to make peace and do business and, you know, are Western facing. But you can't possibly classify the whole of the Iranian bourgeoisie like that, because if you did, you can't make sense of what Iran has done over the last 40 years. You know, the reality is that despite constant pressure from imperialism and constant efforts by the Zionists in the region and the imperialists generally to overthrow an independent government that's striving to maintain Iranian sovereignty, the Iranian state has developed a huge self-defense capacity. It's developed a huge amount of homegrown industry. It's developed high levels of education, a huge scientific and technological establishment. They're able to meet the West's technology in many, many fields now. And in some fields, they've overtaken. Iran has hypersonic missiles that the US still can't manufacture. They haven't cracked the technology yet. So the idea that all of this has been done by a totally comprador ruling class doesn't make any sense. But yes, it's definitely true that there are sections within the Iranian bourgeoisie who are comprador, who do have influence in business, in government, in the media, and are constantly pushing in the direction of reversing the gains of the revolution and turning Iran back into a dependent colony.
And then just a follow-up question, how would you define that mentality? Because, for example, when I was in education system in high school in Iran, I was never taught about anything about U.S. imperialism, none of that. And you would imagine that, everything that the U.S., the wars and everything, I was very impoverished back in Iran. And it wasn't until I got out of Iran, and especially during this last month, I've gotten into, what imperialism and the understanding of that. So I'm just trying to understand what is the imperialism mentality? If you could define that for me, please. Appreciate it.
Just small questions. So I would say the mentality of those sections of the bourgeoisie who want to facilitate imperialist takeover of Iran is a servile mentality. They have the mentality of compradors. They don't have the sense of national pride or honor. They have a sense of inferiority, but they also just have a very kind of selfish approach to life generally, that if they think they can make some money out of it, they don't care who's going to suffer as a result. in terms of your, your experience in a school in Iran, obviously I can't speak to that, but it surprises me somewhat. It doesn't chime with the experience of many Iranians I've met. So, I guess we'd have to have another conversation some other time about when and where you went to school and what kind of school it was and all the rest of it. But probably should leave it there for now.
Thanks a million, Jodi, and thanks, Mumtaz. Thibault, I think you're next, and then if there's time, David as well, and others. Are you okay for time?
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks, Jodi.
The Rafat and Carly Mahagut, Jodi's been following your lectures and the literature of your party for the forms about a year now. It's been very illuminating and also electrifying and straight to the point in terms of like looking at these issues. And just the story there about the people from the Muslim Brotherhood was really quite harrowing. Like I think that's something that really ought to be documented and put down. And it was interesting that you noted Sinn Féin in particular and how they have really sold out in Ireland, because you hear a lot now from the liberal left and stuff that, oh, Sinn Féin are drifting rightwards because they're addressing migration in their policy. And I kind of retort well, Sinn Féin have drifted to the right about 2 decades ago when they accepted the European Union as an infrastructure and very much want to become a part of it. And it is, as you said, just really quite sad because now recently they are completely unprompted, for no reason whatsoever, inserting themselves into the gender identity culture war. And it's just not going well for them. It's just wreaking on havoc and backlash from all sides and for no reason, for no gain whatsoever. And there is maybe a thing to be said in Ireland that historically, the left was brought by the Republican movement, and even now saying the dissident Republican movement, but perhaps there is a critique that because it wasn't, as you said, it wasn't as consistent in bringing a Marxist analysis or a class line analysis, despite being anti-imperialist, that perhaps that might illuminate as to where we are today with the left in Ireland. But I guess from that, my question would be, I'd actually would ask if you could give a bit more experience of a bit more on your experience and of your party throughout the various anti-war movements and the Stop the War Coalition. For example, I know you've discussed how initiatives and right-thinking ideas and motions by your party were stopped by the bureaucracy for, you might illuminate one reason or another. I think we can kind of guess that, but then I suppose what have been your experience there and the lessons that we can take in terms of either A, leveraging our positions within such movements if possible to advance the cause, or ejecting the enemies, or even C, if assessing whether if such fronts, coalitions or movements are worth engaging with depending on the variables or factors that are present in them. Thank you.
Thanks, Thibault. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of Sinn Féin and the IDPOL thing, yeah, absolutely. When I saw them jumping on the self-ID, your whole gender thing, I was like, it's another kiss of death, isn't it? It's a total retreat in the face of bourgeois propaganda. When you think that the bourgeois propaganda that was thrown at Sinn Féin and the IRA in the days of the liberation struggle, and they knew how to stand up to it, it's kind of disgusting to see the next generation just on their knees in front of everyone, just begging to be allowed to be in the establishment and jumping on every imperialist inspired propaganda bandwagon, and just auditioning to be allowed to join the club of EU bosses and bureaucrats. Yeah, it's a tragedy for Ireland as far as I'm concerned. But that's their shortcoming, and that's a gap that they're leaving that someone else is going to fill. And I hope you guys are going to be part of that. If you said nice things about my work and my party's work, and it's really nice to know that the things that we do are useful to others, around the world. And that's one of the, I mean, social media is a very bloody double-edged sword, isn't it? But the nice aspect of it is that, and the handy fact that we speak English is that quite a lot of people around the world who are looking for this information can find it and make use of it. And we're really grateful that despite being a small organization, we are able to have a bit of reach and help people in other places facing similar problems to the ones we face. And we do have, I think one of the things that's useful about us is we've been pushing the same type of a line for a long time through many difficult situations. And so it kind of steals you. You know, when you've fought this fight at times when it was absolutely the hardest, most impossible, most ridiculous thing as far as everyone around you was concerned, then as conditions get easier, you know, even when the hysterical propaganda waves keep coming, you know, you're just like, yeah, whatever, I've seen all this before. It doesn't knock me down in the way that it might once have done. I did recently deliver a talk in Tunisia that people here might like to watch. It's called How the Left failed Syria. And I can't recap all of what was in that now because it will take up too much of your time. But essentially, I kind of did analysis of, or a kind of overview of our history in the anti-war movement in Britain. And just to very quickly recap, we were affiliated to the Stop the War movement in Britain. I worked in it when I was in the Socialist Labour Party. When our party was formed 21 years ago, we immediately affiliated to Stop the War. It was the early days then of the Iraq War, because that was 2004. We regularly took, and in those earlier days, from 2004 up to 2011, and you know, back from 2001, Stop the War was a big mass movement. At the time of the invasion of Iraq, it was huge. And when they had national conferences, there were many delegates, and they were coming from branches all around the country. And those branches were real organizations. They were vibrant. There was a lot of course, kind of controlled leadership in the branches and in the national organization. But there were a huge number of ordinary working class British people involved in that movement who really did want to do something to stop wars. And 2 years running, our party took resolutions to the National Conference of Stop the War, basically putting forward a programme whereby Stop the War would adopt the position of pushing in the trade unions and elsewhere for a campaign of mass non-cooperation. And you can only build a campaign like that through organized labor, right? It really needs to be something you take up through big organizations. It's not individuals making conscience choices. It's whole big organizations using their organized weight to say, our members will not cooperate with the war machine. That means in the media, that means making munitions and materials, that means in transport and logistics, that means fighting, it means everything across the board, right? I personally worked at the BBC those days, and I pushed for that line inside my union, which was Bectu, and I actually got my branch of BBC workers several years running to approve motions on that topic so that I could then argue it at national conference of the trade union. And you should have seen the way they maneuvered to stop debates happening when they were going to be vibrant and engaging, to stop us arguing for motions each year. And they changed the rules of how their conference ran each year just for me and my branch. It was blatant. Every year it was harder to write a resolution that said anything. And then it was harder to speak to a resolution. We started doing all kinds of like guerrilla tactics of like putting on film shows or writing leaflets with our arguments in, because they wouldn't let us do any argumentation in the motion or on the floor of the conference, right? And like putting them under doors of people's bedrooms in the hotel and getting told off for that. You know, it's doing anything we could to try to put these arguments in front of people. Now, this comes a little bit to, sorry, I'll just finish. In Stop the War, twice we put motions across, and twice they were basically unanimously approved by the delegates who were assembled. So Stop the War's official policy to this day, if you go by its democratic process, is that they're in favour of calling for working in the trade unions for a campaign of mass non-cooperation with the war machine. But what happened? Absolutely zero. So the first year, nothing happened. They shelved the resolution, did nothing about it. We came back the next year, reminded them this is the policy, put forward another resolution, backed it up with a leaflet reminding everybody this is what Stop the War Coalition agreed. It was unanimously passed. Again, it was shelved. Then the next thing that happened was that NATO started building up its aggression towards Libya. And when they were running that hysterical propaganda against Libya and against Colonel Gaddafi, Stop the War organized one event relating to Libya, and it was a picket outside the Libyan embassy against the crimes of Gaddafi. Right? So they basically completely capitulated to the imperialist propaganda line. You had Owen Jones running around going, everybody knows that nobody's going to cry for the fall of this awful dictator Gaddafi, you know. So we said, this is outrageous. Stop the War should not be doing this. This is treachery. And we were promptly expelled by a leadership that had never been elected on the basis of a rule book that didn't exist. And when we went to stop the war, we turned up at their next annual conference to try and speak from the floor and object. They wouldn't let us have one single minute on the microphone. And something that I always think, you know, for a long time we didn't talk about this because it wasn't the right time to be, you know, demonizing the man. But these days, I think it's useful for people to know that the person chairing that meeting, who was absolutely steely in his determination that we would not speak, was Jeremy Corbyn, Mr. Nice Man of the left, right? So he knows what his job is. He's always known what his job is. And it's to keep people like us out who might put a genuine working class program in front of the working class. But it kind of brings me back to the end of what your question was, which is it worth engaging with all this controlled opposition stuff? And the fact is that, yes, it is. It's worth being where working class people are mobilized and wanting to do something. You can't leave them to the leadership of these people who will just spit them out as disenfranchised, disillusioned, pessimistic people. And they'll never know why their energies and activities didn't get them anywhere if there's no one to explain it to them. So hard as it is and frustrating as it is, the reality is the conditions are much, much better now than they were then. Back in 2003, when I was arguing to people in the BBC that it's a war crime to put out propaganda in favor of the Iraq war, that was a hard sell. People believed in the system. They believed it was before the whole sexy dossier business, right? They still believed that Tony Blair probably thought he was doing the right thing, you know, and well, you should support our boys. There were all kinds of, you know, there was a huge level of background trust in the system, in politicians, in the law, in the media, in all the things now that people are totally cynical about. But back at that time, when I was having those arguments with people, it was very hard. And yet I was able, just by, you know, bloody-minded perseverance, to get a majority several years running in branches of my members in order to be able to take that argument to the National Conference and expose them and force them to listen to the arguments and force all the people who'd come there to listen to arguments that otherwise they would never hear from anywhere. And that, you know, fundamentally, while we're at this stage of development, our most important job is putting arguments in front of people. I remember I had a comrade years ago who used to get frustrated that our party was small and bloody stayed small. And, you know, he was like, are we just a bloody propaganda organisation? It's like, well, in many ways...
I feel it getting slightly, but look, I've nothing on, only that little light chart.
In many ways, yes. We are a propaganda organisation. Of course, we want to organise the masses, but no, it's got to be around something. It's got to be around an analysis and understanding, a programme. And so the first thing you've got to do is start to beat down all of the prejudice that people are carrying. They've had their heads full of so many lies. Well, I think the conditions for doing that now are 1,000 times better than they were when I started in the movement 30 years ago. And they're getting better all the time. So, you know, history and the development of conditions are very much on our side right now. And we're being presented, like Morgan was saying earlier about Syria, you know, the conditions are developing so fast now. The crisis of imperialism is deepening so rapidly. The war drive is accelerating. Developments are happening on a daily basis that can, you know, open the eyes of more and more people. So there's a lot to work with now, I think.
Great, Joti. I mean,
Joti, that was genuinely really inspiring, and thank you so much for that. There's a lot to take from it. I hope to make something of it. Thank you so much again.
Thanks, Steve-O. Jody, but it's inspiring because to hear, that you're still energized and you're still determined, because I feel like I am always that woman in the space going, but, and people are rolling eyes and here she goes again, or in WhatsApp groups or in any conversation where, even in the spaces that are revolutionary and radical and like, but, chat constantly challenge, and it's exhausting. But to look at you, you don't seem a bit exhausted at all. So that is, like as Thibaut said, it's inspiring.
Can I just say something to that? I think that the key to not losing your passion and your energy, apart from, you do have to pace yourself a little bit, right? Because my dad used to say that, being a revolutionary is a marathon runner's game, not a sprinter's game, right? You're in this for life. It's a long bloody struggle. It's a hard bloody struggle. You can't throw yourself at it like the revolution's in the next 5 minutes because you'll burn out. You have to find a pace that you can repeat every single flipping day. It is relentless in that respect. But the two things I think that really keep you on point and keep you optimistic are, number one, being in an organization. So having behind you a group of people that you work with, who you discuss with, whose strategy and tactics you have agreed with. So you're not just a lone operator, a kind of voice crying in the wilderness. You actually have a program, you have a policy, you have an agreed plan that you're trying to implement. However hard it is, however slow the progress might seem to be, it builds up incrementally. Only have to look here and how, it's quite a new phenomenon, actually, for me to be in a situation where random people in the world have heard of me and heard of my party and our work, right? Well, that's only come about from this kind of dogged, systematic, day by day, doing the bloody work. And most of it's been exceptionally unglamorous, right? But you do it because it's the right thing. And the thing that I think, beyond all of everything, that keeps you optimistic and keeps your sense of perspective about what you're doing and stops you getting disheartened is study. Our party absolutely prioritizes both personal and collective study. And I found that the one thing that's like an inoculation against pessimism is reading a bit of a classic text every day, even if it's just for 10, 15 minutes, something from Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin. It just puts everything in perspective. It gives you that top up in your kind of system of scientific understanding that stops you getting overwhelmed by pessimism, stops you falling prey to pragmatism, which is the absolute death of a revolutionary consciousness, right? And helps you just see the big picture. And when you keep the big picture in mind and your small contributions to it on this, on the daily basis, have a framework within which you can make sense of it all, then I think you don't lose your way and you don't lose your passion or your ability to cope with the ups and downs of the daily struggle and the difficulties sometimes you have in, trying to present truth to people who've been so brainwashed and bombarded with rubbish.
Thanks, Jodi. Yeah, great to hear that. I'm very lucky that I have good comrades. I won't say elders. One of them's not here, Barry Murray, but he's in the Communist Party Ireland and he's a former prisoner of war, a proper revolutionary. So whenever, and another man who is a Kurdish freedom fighter as well. And whenever I get frustrated or annoyed or start texting Barry, who's up in the north, he always sends me a snippet from Lenin. And he's always asked me, where am I at on my reading? He's
Yeah.
Have you, so when I borrow a book, I'm getting tested before I give it back to him. But it's great. It's great. And the level-headedness of him, and sometimes I think, is it because he, people like Tommy McKerney, Sammy, Barry Murray, is it because they spent time in jail as well that they had to learn patience? And Barry said the last day, no, we built a Marxist library. That's what it was, learning, study, and being committed to the theoretical side as much as being on the streets or trying to convince people. Dave, you have your hand up a good long time. Sorry, thanks for your patience.
No, thank you. Well, just on that subject as well about study and educating yourself. I've like a theory, I suppose. We're not a theory, an assumption maybe of the people who are the anti-immigrant brigade. They're they're not educated in world affairs, and their kind of politics tend to be localized. And like politics in Ireland tends to be localized, and community is ingrained in political life. You get Mikey Healy Ray, whatever his name is, like trying to get a bus route for Anne Mary on a Sunday to play bingo or something. So my question will be is that, and this may sound a bit naive, but I've been thinking about it. I've been thinking about approaching you, Roisin, as well about this, to maybe have a sit down or try and arrange a sit down or a meeting with like leaders of these anti-immigrants brigades, not to chastise them or to patronize them, but to kind of educate them, I suppose, camouflagely or and kind of subtly educate them without being patronizing, and see if they can make sense of what we see as bigger picture thinkers that they fail to see or even try to refuse to even think about. Because I've had conversations with people, anti-immigrant people, and they just don't care what's going on in a bigger world or what's causing this kind of systemic oppression or the reasons for climate refugees, economic refugees, and other refugees. They're not looking above above their own localized spheres to see where the causes of migration is coming from, or the factors that contribute to it. So I was wondering if would it be naive, or have you even tried to yourself to kind of sit or meet with, because I think if we can try and make bridges with the anti-immigrant brigade, we could be a bit more unified in our approach towards a bigger picture or a bigger.
Thanks, Dave. I think that's a really interesting question and a pertinent one. There's two things that instantly spring to my mind. One is I always make a distinction between the leaders of these movements who, when it comes to the anti-immigration movement, I think are basically state-backed provocateurs. Certainly in Britain they are. So there's no point debating them because they're not sincere actors. And the people who get caught up in them, the followers. And so those people are people you want to reach and talk to, definitely. And any way that you can get in a conversation, whether it's one-to-one or with a group, and sit down and have a kind of open discussion, is good. There's something else I think it's just such a historical irony, so I don't know whether to laugh or cry about it sometimes, looking at Ireland and seeing Irish working people screaming about immigration. There's, on so many levels, it's so crazy. It feels a bit Monty Python. But, the first case in British imperialism of its racist scapegoating of migrants was against the Irish. Right, the writings of Marx and Engels are full of how the Irish were used by British imperialism in Britain and in Ireland. I did a very tiny summation of that in a pamphlet I wrote. Sorry, here we go. This one. Sorry, shameless plug. On identity politics and talking of. Bless you. I've got a friend over there. So. Somewhere in here, I did a very small summation of that strategy that was developed by British imperialism in relation to the Irish, and then rolled out to be used to scapegoat and justify the oppression of and wars against all kinds of people all over the world. And it's one of the reasons I always remind people that racism is not about skin color, right? Because Irish are white, the Jews were white, it's got nothing to do with what color somebody is. There's not some inherent thing about skin color that makes you a target or not a target of racism. It's a tool of imperialism to divide and conquer, to justify its wars abroad, and to justify the separation and division of workers at home. And the Irish were the first victims of all of that, the first colony of the British Empire, and the first, displaced, starved, abused people, the first population of kind of under proletariat, in Britain. And that's a really important history that I think, if you could write something or create something very simple about that and bring it to the notice of, Irish workers who are being sucked into this nonsense about immigration, and, highlight also the fact that Ireland is actually still empty because of these crimes that Britain committed against us. It's a lie to say that Ireland is full. People who are telling you that are misleading you, and they are setting up a completely false narrative and leading you up the garden path and setting you against other workers, just the way English workers were set against Irish workers, 150 years ago in the cities, industrial cities of Britain. This is an old pattern, and it's imperialist pattern, and it's a trick that they endlessly make us fall for, and we're letting ourselves be taken for fools. They're treating us like toddlers who don't know anything, who have no memory, either recent or historical, and I think that's something that can appeal to people if you just explain to them honestly, look, it's not me that's patronizing you, it's the ruling class. They're treating you like a bloody idiot. Right? To swallow the same story over and over again, and a story that's even been used against your own grandfathers, to justify their subjugation and their super exploitation as disposable and really cheap labor force in British cities. There's no way that people that you're talking don't have relations who that has affected. And, I think because of your history in Ireland, you've got some really good starting points for some of these conversations, which are much harder to have in Britain. Although even in Britain, a huge number of our workers who now run around being racist against the recent immigrants are themselves only third or fourth generation, from immigrants themselves, most of them bloody Irish, right? So actually, if you just are able to stop and sit down with people who are genuinely wanting to know why they're in so much trouble and what should be done about it, if they're genuine people and not just paid provocateurs, you've got a lot of good openings, and it's always worth just trying.
I'm gonna shamelessly plug your book again. What's the name of it?
Identity Politics or Class Politics.
And is that excerpt that just talk about Irish and British imperial? Is that in that book? Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you. I'll buy it.
It's only a few paragraphs worth. It's not like a massive great thing. I just summed it up as a kind of case in point about how racism serves imperialism.
Thanks, Jodi. I think also the fact that, we have a manufactured housing crisis, healthcare crisis, cost of living. I even hate that term, but it really, the problems with those things is that, as Catherine says here, the cost of living, the daily struggles, it's understandable why ordinary people aren't interested maybe in Palestine or in anything, because you're so busy, so distracted.
Sorry, Roisin, you reminded me something. Can I butt in? Is it possible?
Yeah.
Very briefly, because I know housing is such a key and massive issue amongst, angry workers in Ireland right now, I really think it's worth revisiting Engels' brilliant little pamphlet on the housing question and seeing if you can't summarize it and put in modern examples and just make a kind of, extended leaflet that summarizes what's in that, because essentially all the arguments are there. why it is that there's a permanent and worsening housing crisis in conditions of capitalist economics, that it's about capitalism, not about housing. It's about the fact that housing is produced as a commodity and not for need and use, right? That's the problem. It's got nothing to do with this government or that government's policies or who is or isn't allowed in the country, or, you know, everybody's constantly directed towards the idea that it's to do with who you elect or who's in the country or who's in the government, or, you know, what their policy is. But it's not. This is the way that capitalist production relations work. And we have a folk memory. Again, you know, we had a period of time, I'm not exactly sure how it worked in Ireland, but in Britain, the post-World War II kind of social consensus gave us council housing, which meant that a whole load of housing was produced not as a commodity, but for use, directly produced by councils and given to people who needed it. So we actually had, for a short period of time in Britain, working class people had the right to a home. Then they brought in right to buy. And I always say to my comrades, the right to buy was the abolition of the right to a home, right? And they brought back commodity relations for everybody in housing. And what we now have is a massive homelessness crisis, of course. And that's capitalism working as normal. That's not an aberration. That's how the system works. You don't get what you can't pay for. That's it.
And then they did the same here. They followed Thatcher's way, and it's still happening, you know, where social housing.
It's the capitalist way.
It's a capitalist, doesn't matter which party. I mean, they change the words sometimes. I think Sinn Féin's housing policy is called affordable housing. They just, you know, keep changing. I know, affordable for whom? And Ollie, you've been waiting, and I want to bring you in here if you've time, Jodi. Sorry, I'm pushing my luck now. But I'll look at angles and I'll do that job if you answer Ollie's question.
Yeah, look, I don't want to take up too much of your time, Jodi, and just feel kind of maybe this sounds a bit pompous, but privileged to be in a meeting with you. I just think the work that you and your party do is of immense value, and if you ever doubt that you shouldn't, particularly given the kind of deficits, I guess, in political education that I sometimes see in this side of the Irish Sea. Your first comment about Ukraine's position on Sinn Féin's position on Ukraine, I think, was very well made, you know, and it's a kind of a litmus test, I think, on I suppose your position on imperialism, I think, and Ukraine and also Syria. And it's not just Sinn Féin, the largest Trotskyist party in Ireland, People Before Profit, relentlessly equivocates on Syria and also Ukraine. And it's an absolute failing of understanding and courage. And I just wondered, and it's a bit late in the evening, if you would have a view on it. I just think there are a lot of people inside that, let's just call it what it is, the Trotskyist left, who may understand imperialism but may know the you know, the scientific understanding of what's going on in the world, but are too fearful or too canny to say it out loud because of how they might be received in the bourgeois press. And secondly, it may be still thinking and acting within the legacy of the Cold War Trotskyist position, you know, to condemn a plague on both your houses, you know. And I think it's a massive failing. And I'm just wondering, it's unfair of me to ask you to comment on the particularities of the Irish left. So maybe other people might have a view on why it is that there's such a weakness and in how parties and groups on the left articulate imperialism in Ireland. Yeah, that would be it. Again, an unfair question so late in the day. That'd be my question.
I'm prepared for that one too. This is not my pamphlet. This was mainly a text written by my father, but I contributed a little bit to it. It's called Trotskyism. Can you see that? Tool of Imperialism. Right. And it's taken out of a bigger book written by my father about 30 years ago called Trotskyism or Leninism. For those people who don't know, I had the good fortune to be born into a communist family, and my father, Joti Brar, was a deep Marxist scholar and thinker as well as an activist. So I had a head start in getting on the right track when I decided to be a political activist myself 30 years ago. I didn't have to wander around the movement looking for a home. I found one straight away. Although I have to say, just on the personal note, it took me a while to realise that I had a home politically, because, you know, when you're a teenager, you don't want to be aligned with your parents on anything, do you? So, but once I actually looked into what my parents' politics were, I realised, whether I liked it or not, they were the rightest people I knew. So that was that. Then I started studying myself. So the reason I showed you that, and you know, the title is really important, Tool of Imperialism, is that Trotskyism, as a trend, as a political philosophy, whatever you want to call it, doesn't understand imperialism, and that's not an accident. From Trotsky himself to the movement that his ideas spawned, essentially its main characteristic has always been to be anti-communist and pro-imperialist. The essence of Trotskyism is that it supports imperialism. So it denies Lenin's thesis on imperialism. It denies the reality of oppressed nations being able to be revolutionary, or of peasants being able to be, poor peasants being able to be revolutionary. It essentially acts in Britain today. I would say every Trotskyist organization in some way or another is supported by the state. I consider Trotskyist leaderships to be full-on agents of the state. Absolutely not worth your time trying to debate them. They're not going to change their minds. They're paid agents. Their supporters are something different. It's like what we said about the far-right provocateurs. They're led by provocateurs who are agents of the state. But those agents are there to gather discontent of various types. The job of Trotskyist organizations is to pick up revolutionary-minded youth who have always been a really important reserve of the revolutionary movement in any successful revolution, to pick them up and to reinforce their anti-communist prejudice in the name of revolution. So it's a very nasty, insidious trick that they play on the people. But that, of course, is why the people before profit grouping can't possibly get it right on the essence, important questions of the day regarding imperialism and anti-imperialism. In Ireland, maybe they're a bit more shamefaced about it than they are in Britain. In Britain, they're out there waving Ukraine flags and marching and saying, send more bombs to Zelensky. I mean, absolutely, you know, the TUC in Britain passed a resolution in solidarity, stand with Ukraine. I mean, that's the imperialist slogan, right? Demanding that the government do more to fuel the Ukraine war from the NATO side. They're not doing enough, you know, that's their radicalism. And they got the TUC to back a resolution like that was full of Russophobia, full of lies about the origin or the cause or the waging of the conflict, that cited Ukrainian trade unionists who were all basically NATO provocateurs and placemen and agents. So, you know, this is the way Trotskyism behaves, and this is what Trotskyism's role is. And as with so many situations, really, our job is to reach the people who are being fooled by these leaders, help them see how they're being manipulated against their own interests, against what they really want to be doing, which is contributing to improving the world and society. And in the case of young students, obviously they genuinely have a revolutionary ardor, you know, but it gets misused, misdirected. And I always used to talk about Trotskyist organizations like it's like running a bath with the plug out. This constant flow of youthful energy, you keep it busy for a couple of years, running around, chasing its tail, and it falls out of the movement, cynical, disenfranchised, and under the impression that it tried being a socialist, and it all can't work. And that's a massive disservice it does to our movement. Unfortunately, because students have also been so massively brainwashed by gender ideology and identity politics, and the Trotskyites, of course, lap all that stuff up and amplify it, as they amplify all bourgeois propaganda, then we've got quite a mountain to climb when it comes to reclaiming the minds and the energy of our youth and students. But again, I think that the conditions now are such that is going to happen. I think there's going to begin to be a genuine reevaluation by young people of the gender ideology and the pup they've been sold with all of that. I think people are going to start to realize that was very much a top-down campaign. This wasn't a liberation movement that came up from the grassroots. This was something that's been pushed on people through all the state institutions. And young people don't like to conform to that type of thing. And I think there's going to be a reassessment and reevaluation of that on behalf of significant numbers of young people soon. And I like to hope that our party is well positioned to catch the fallout as that develops, because we were amongst the very tiny number of people who took a principled and consistent and scientific stance against gender ideology rather than playing culture wars with it, right? We haven't jumped on a kind of, it's about nice people with rainbows or, fuck the trannies. It's this kind of, let's, again, like the fascist, anti-fascist, let's have a punch up. We're not in favor of any of that nonsense. We're here to explain to people how they're being manipulated and why and who by and why it's not in their interests. And when it comes to, sorry, it's a bit off your topic, but it's kind of on the topic because of Trotskyism and students. But, when it comes to the gender ideology, it really is an attack on the working class in a way that a lot of people haven't really caught on to what it means, that you are attacking the very foundations of socialist science when you agree with the proposition that you are what you think you are. Right? That is full idealism. That is the kind of magical thinking that the ruling class wants you to engage in, because if your worldview is like that, you can be totally manipulated in all kinds of directions. You have no basis for understanding the world. The whole basis of Marxist science, historical and dialectical materialism, is that there is such a thing as material reality. It has laws and you can understand what those are, and the world is knowable and understandable, and it doesn't depend on your presence or your ability to sense it or your ability to interpret it, or it's there whether you like it or not. And it's the same, the body you were born in is the body you were born in, and you're not going to change it by imagining it's a different one. So this is not actually about even the mental health of some alienated young people, or the medical pharmaceutical company and the horrific campaign of child abuse that they've been waging with the backing of the state. It's actually about something deeper when it comes to the prospects for revolution, right? That it's really, really important that we defend material reality. And that not in a culture wars way, but in a way that educates people and teaches them to think, right? Use their bloody brains and not let themselves be overwhelmed by hysterical propaganda, which we see in so many cases. And I'm ranting, but this is something that we see time and time again. And you'd think by now people start to spot the pattern. Maybe it's just because I've been in the movement so long, it screams at me. If you're getting overwhelming hysterical propaganda about something, the ruling class is trying to make you feel something that they want you to feel. And you should be suspicious. You should be taking a step back. You should be breathing. You should be not jumping on board. You should be not just assuming that the feelings you're having must reflect something true. You should be like, okay, ruling class is having a massive fit about something, and it's time for me to stop and consider before I jump in. And it's exactly what they did with Ukraine, right? Massive emotional overwhelm of wall-to-wall propaganda screaming at you, so that it's like, well, either you stand with Ukraine or you're the most evil fascist that ever lived, right? Pick. And you're like, oh my God, I don't want to be the evil fascist, but if you're going to be a revolutionary, you've got to study, you've got to learn to stand your ground when these onslaughts come, and realize that they do also subside. And if you are able to stand your ground when all this crap is going off and just remain calm and be scientific and clear, even if no one wants to listen to you on the day you're doing that, when they're being overwhelmed, a year down the line, they'll be turning around going, oh, now I see why you didn't go along with everything. right? But no one's going to respect you or turn to you if you roll over every time the bourgeoisie starts screaming hysterically. Sorry, that was a bit.
That happened to us with Syria. You sort of feel vindicated in a way, but yeah, thanks. Somebody said, please keep ranting. I could listen to you all night, Joti. It's not ranting, it's pure passion. It's beautiful. Stephen, I can't let you go without Stephen having to have probably a tricky question for you. Go on, Stephen. You're still muted. We can't hear you.
No, unmuted
Yeah,
now.
hear you now.
Yeah, I was inclined to say nothing because, you know, Roisin already said she was pushing her luck, but that rant kind of roused me to have one more, to throw in another question. Very stimulating, really, really thought-provoking, and most of my notes are things that I want to delve deeper into. But there is a question that came up for me fairly early on when you started talking, Joti, and that's, you know, this. I feel like there's a, you know, despite the horrors of the current moment, there is a lot of commentary talking about, you know, this is essentially the beginning of the end. This is the darkest hour before dawn, the end of the impending end of the US-led empire. And, you know, I guess my question to you is, do you feel there's any truth in that, or is the demise of the empire, the reports of the demise, the reports of the coming death of the empire, you know, reflected in Trump, reflected in the defeat in Ukraine, reflected in the debauchery and you know, insanity of Israel, the rise of China, the resilience of Iran. Is that, do you see it that way? Or is the empire just going to ride this out and maybe shift form?
Well, so they're two different questions, actually. Yes, I do see it that way. I often say to my comrades when they're feeling overwhelmed and disheartened, look around you. This is the last days of Rome. Can you, I mean, this is rock bottom for this system. Look how decayed and senile, as you said, debauched in every respect, and how crumbling every aspect of imperial power has become, how they have nothing to offer in any respect, you know, and they no longer innovate in terms of technology. They're behind in terms of, you know, military. They're behind. Their power is waning. You know, they couldn't hold out. Their huge firepower and naval power in the Red Sea has basically been beaten by Yemeni drones, right? This is huge. This is a massive, massive defeat, as is the defeat of the entire military and economic power of NATO in Ukraine is huge. The inability of Israel to crush the resistance in Gaza, despite funneling plane loads of heavy bombs into the country on a daily basis for a year and a half. They've destroyed a whole lot of infrastructure, destroyed the lives of people. They're doing everything they can to starve a population, but they haven't been able to crush the resistance. They are imploding themselves much faster than they are degrading the resistance. In fact, Israel is hanging by a thread right now, by an absolute thread. And if it wasn't for the constant funneling of more money and things to prop it up, it would have imploded. There's no way Israel has got the means to survive what's been done to it by the resistance over the last year and a half. And all of this is huge. You know, the imperialist hold on the Middle East is weaker than it's ever been. And US imperialism, you know, Chairman Mao referred to it as a paper tiger all the way back in the 70s. And it's so much truer today than it was then. You know, industrially, it's hollowed out in terms of its own manufacturing base. It's become a really senile imperialist power, like Britain was, you know, after World War II, with all of its essentially economic activity being just, you know, drawing dividends from abroad, and all of the fragility that gives actually to the home economy, because it completely relies on everybody else in the world staying in the position you've given them. of, you know, supplying this and that type of material to you and this and that profit, and allowing themselves to become a permanent source of goods and wealth for your system to continue. And even if they stay in place, you're still not stable. But the reality is they're not all staying in place. They're everywhere around the world. People are fighting back for sovereignty, for independence, for socialism in different, you know, different ways in different places. And the USA is not able to crush them all. They're trying. They've been trying. Look how hard they tried to crush Venezuela. They didn't succeed. They did not succeed. And Venezuela's starting to climb out of that. And, you know, I mean, Cuba's in a dire, parlous situation right now, but equally, you know, there's moves of BRICS to start to change around that. And I hope very much that that's also on the cusp of turning around. I hope. I mean, after Syria, you know, you can't say never, but, you know, they have a pretty motivated population in Cuba as well as in Venezuela. I think, yes, we are looking at the last days of Rome. Decay and senility of the system is all around us. But does that mean it's impossible for the imperialists to kind of temporary restability for themselves for another 10, 20 years off the back of drowning the world in blood? No, it's not impossible. That's why it's really, really important for us to do our job. This is a moment here. There's a historical opportunity in front of us that's really self-evident. If you study Marxism, if you've studied the history of imperialism, you're like, oh my God, we're in the throes of the opening salvos of World War III have already happened. We're in this growing period of deep economic crisis. And that's another thing that is kind of hidden from people, how deep the economic crisis is. How desperate the imperialists are. That's what they can't step back from their wars, even though they keep losing them. They have to have a payout. They're in such deep economic trouble. If they don't get a payout soon, they're going into meltdown. They seem to have adopted a strategy of just quietly printing money to bail out every failing business. But of course, the quiet money printing approach, while it kind of keeps the lid on social unrest for now, it kicks the can down the road, doesn't it? Because what we're seeing is it causes massive inflation. And the inflation now is worldwide. For a while, they were getting away with exporting their inflation, but now it's also coming home. And they can't keep it under control. And it's only going to get worse because the only solution they've got every time there's a meltdown of a corporation or a big financial institution is just print a load of money and pretend it didn't happen. And you can't keep doing that and think there's going to be no effects. I remember talking to my daughter about it a few years ago, that this was what they were doing. And she said to me, oh, Mum, why are they doing that? Don't they know what happened in Weimar Germany? I said, yeah, absolutely right. You know, there comes a point where runaway inflation, you know, is something that you just, you know, can't escape from the social consequences of. The imperialists, everything they're doing is a short-term kick the can down the road in the hope that something turns up to save them. And the something that they are hoping will turn up is somehow a regime change in Russia or China or both, that then they can dance in and install, proxy comprador governments and, you know, carve the place up and loot it and have a bonanza and happy days. But how long, even if they got their way, they'll be back to here in 20 years, and we'll be fighting the same fight again. And those 20 years will be 20 years of, you know, worse immiseration for the masses of the planet. Look what happened to us after the fall of the Soviet Union, if you want proof. You know, there is an opportunity. Imperialism is weak and getting weaker in many ways, but it is dangerous. It has a lot of resources financially. It can't fight peer-to-peer against Russia or China, but it can throw a huge amount of money at trying to destabilize them in 1,000 other ways, as we saw with Syria, right? So it's really important for us to recognize that even though there's a anti-imperialist bloc increasingly coalescing and working together, which is fantastically positive for the people of the world that is going on, and the stronger and more united the anti-imperialist bloc gets, the better it is for all of us, right? But imperialism isn't beaten until it's beaten at home. We have a job in each country to topple our governments and stop them from being looters of the planet. In Ireland, it's a slightly different one, but, you know, I can only speak from the situation of the British worker, which is we cannot as progressives in Britain, sit on the sidelines and cheer on the anti-imperialist bloc and say, yay, the multipolar world's winning, thank goodness, like it's a bloody football game. We have to recognize that imperialism won't be dead until we've finished it off at home. And that's what solidarity really means, right? That's what internationalism really means. It means pinning down your own ruling class and stopping them from getting up to their dastardly deeds all around the world. And ultimately it means deposing them completely so they're not able to get back on it, and expropriating all that ill-gotten wealth that they're sitting on, you know, and breaking that up. You know, people talk about Russia as a new imperialist power, and it's so ridiculous when you stop and look and think about it, you know, because there's the hoard of finance capital that was in Russia at the time of the Russian Revolution was expropriated, right? The wealth that was then captured by a new bourgeoisie after the fall of socialism was not in the form of finance capital. It was in the form of national assets and national industries, and Russia became, for a while, it was almost totally recolonized. The reason that Putin is so hated is because he represents a national bourgeois class in Russia that decided that while they wouldn't mind cooperating in terms of trade and politics on the world stage with the West, they wanted to be treated with respect. They wanted to be treated as equal partners, and they wanted to determine their own fate for themselves and use their own resources as they saw fit. And the imperialists were absolutely outraged, because as far as they were concerned, Russia's position was to be their servant and their oil well with a flag and something they could just loot at will, and not have to trade with on equal terms. And that is really the root of all the Russophobia that we see today, is this just the bile, the anger, the incandescent rage of the Anglo-American imperialists that Russia had the cheek to think they had the right to sovereignty when they need its stuff, and there's a government that's in their way.
Brilliant, Joti. Thank you very, very much. The mention of the word sovereignty reminds me of when I'll be meeting you, Ollie, again. We have the big issue of neutrality is in under the spotlight now in bourgeois democracy and a world of bourgeois democracy. And I think that, you know, one of Sammy's out there, he designs banners for us for protests. The last one he designed says, "We serve neither king nor Kaiser nor Zionists." It's great. And maybe the next banner he'll design will be Ireland for bricks, or bricks for Ireland, Ireland for bricks.
You know, the slogan,
you know,
sorry, the
sovereignty is
slogan,
so important. Yeah.
the slogan I like to push over here is that we need to build the British wing of the global axis of resistance, you know, and I think that that's something that kind of resonates with a lot of people right now who are following Palestine and understanding that there's a Middle Eastern axis of resistance, that people are working together against a common enemy. And, you know, it's also our common enemy, right? Anglo-American imperialism. And this axis of resistance is something which is really a global phenomenon. It's BRICS is part of that, actually. You know, whether objectively, not subjectively, everybody there wouldn't agree that they're signed up to the axis of resistance, but in fact, that is what they're doing, whether they know it or not, whether they've meant to or not. You know, that's what we're seeing. And I quite like the axis of resistance as a...
And to legitimize resistance, yeah, what the axis of resistance, what it means. I think you've kind of answered John Herson's question. He mightn't be here, but he did say, what's your thoughts on global solidarity with Gaza, including the current flotilla, the proposed global march to Gaza? Like what you were saying about that the work is to be done at home, you know, confronting.
Yeah, you know, it's... I think we have to be careful about getting sucked into a kind of charity mentality rather than a solidarity mentality. It's not our charity that people need. I remember when I went on the convoy back before that I was on with John, I was very much conscious that for myself, it wasn't about the aid we were bringing in our trucks. For me, it was about the publicity. The whole point was to draw attention to the siege and put pressure on all of the people who were complicit, including Egypt, right? We were trying to go through Egypt, and that would, provoke the Egyptian masses, remind them of how much they hated the fact of their government's complicity in what was being done to Palestine. So for me, it was about trying to get media attention and remind the people of the world and awaken that kind of sentiment and publicize what's happening. It was not about, from my perspective, bringing some trucks of aid. Fundamentally, it's a drop in the ocean. It's a in many ways a pointless exercise. But the publicity angle was what I thought was useful. So, there is an aspect to these things which has a function, but you've got to not get carried away with a kind of savior complex or a charity mentality. Fundamentally, it's a harder job to stay at home and push the arguments everywhere you go, especially in trade unions and organized mass movements, that we need to be organizing en masse, not as individuals and little groups. Right? It's great to see what Palestine Action do and how they've made it very difficult for, Israeli arms companies to operate in Britain, Elbit particularly. But their action shouldn't be necessary, and it should at the very least be backed up by the mass organized working class, rather than being something very separate from them. Then they can be kind of picked off and bullied and harassed and persecuted because they're not part of a big wider movement. And the reality is only in our masses are we really able to shift the dial on these questions, when our governments absolutely are not answerable to us, right? The only thing they'll respond to is force. And as workers, the only force we have is the force of our numbers.
Great. Up the workers. Great, Jodi. Thank you so much. We might debrief after I stop recording, but thank you for your time. Thank you for your energy, the inspiration. You didn't even ask beforehand, what are we talking about? And I had complete faith in that you with your confidence, your belief, your convictions would see through any question, however, tricky it might be. And you really have it's just been wonderful listening to you. And I hope you'll come back. And if you ever want to come back to Ireland and meet in person, there'll always be a welcome here. We really need to talk more as well and face to face. So thank you very much, Jodi. Thank you, everybody, for being a great, I don't want to say audience, but, panel, for asking brilliant questions and for joining in the conversation. Thank you. Slán go fóill.
Thanks so much.